Welcome to the Navic Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Navic's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.navic.co. This episode is brought to you by Overwolf. With over 1,500 games supported, 165,000 creators, and 38 million monthly active users, Overwolf is the guild for in-game creators. Whether you're a gamer, creator, or game studio, Overwolf is the ultimate destination for integrating UGC in games. For game studios, Overwolf offers CurseForge for studios, a white label solution that lets game makers and publishers easily integrate mods safely and seamlessly into their games, both existing and new, at zero cost. It's battle-tested by AAA studios and games, including Maxis with The Sims 4, Studio Wildcard with Ark, Take-Two Interactive, and others. For creators, Overwolf is the all-in-one platform that enables creators to build, distribute, and monetize in-game apps, mods, and game servers. In 2022, Overwolf paid over $160 million to in-game creators, proving that they truly value the talents and contributions of the gaming community. You can check out everything Overwolf has to offer at overwolf.com or check out the details in the show notes. This episode is brought to you by Lightspeed Venture Partners. Lightspeed is a globally leading venture capital firm with over $29 billion in capital under management and more than 500 investments across the US, Europe, and Asia. With its dedicated gaming practice, Lightspeed Gaming, the firm is investing from over $7 billion in early and growth stage capital, making it by far the largest fund focused on gaming and interactive technology. Lightspeed's team combines deep expertise in gaming with a global multi-stage investment platform and a culture that truly puts founders first. Selected investments include Epic Games, Snap, and Stability AI, as well as game designers and producers who led the creation of titles like Fortnite, Call of Duty, League of Legends, Valorant, StarCraft 2, and many more. For more information, simply go to gaming.lsvp.com or check out the details in the show notes. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Bush, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Owen Mahoney. Owen, of course, had a great decade-long run as the CEO of Nexon, and if you're interested in learning from his time there, you should check out our previous 2 episodes with him. But today, we're going to take the conversation in a different direction. Since stepping fully away from Nexon earlier this year, Owen has been cranking out essays about our industry, and some of them are kind of spicy. We'll link to his website in the show notes where you can read the essays yourself. But for this conversation, we have a bunch of really interesting topics to get into, from managing massive game budgets, the struggles of Western publishers, the upside of AI, and more. So I'm personally very excited for this conversation. And Owen, welcome back to the podcast. 3rd round.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. Nice to see you.
Yeah, this is going to be super fun. And I know the last time we talked was when you decided to step away from Nexon. How has life been so far since then? How has maybe taking not as much time in work been for you?
Well, it's been great. I mean, as you know, running a big organization is a all-consuming task, and they usually end up spending a lot of time on people issues, and you spend a little bit of time thinking about strategy and where the industry is going and what your company's place in the industry is, and then you end up spending a lot of time just executing, or 90% of your time executing against that. So it's been nice to have my head out of the game a little bit. I realized I was a little myopic about how things work. A little time and a little space has helped me a lot, and especially talking to everybody else in the industry. I made a point of meeting and talking to other CEOs or game development teams around the world when I was running Nexon, and but I spent a lot more time on that since then, and it's been eye-opening in all sorts of interesting ways.
Yeah, and I've really enjoyed many of the essays that you've written since departing Nexon. And we'll spend most of the episode really digging into the ideas there. But before we do that, I kind of want to zoom out and just hear you talk about why you're writing all of this. Because in general, it's rare for someone of your stature, someone who's been a successful public market CEO, to speak out against the industry that propelled your career to such heights. So why write all of these blog posts? Why speak out against industry practices that you were once a part of?
Well, I'd say first of all, my objective is not to speak out against anything or against the industry in any way. It's really it was a couple of things. Number one, as I was thinking a lot, and you always understand a topic a lot more when you write about something that you're thinking about. You can sort of be glib in your own mind, but when you have to put it, on a page and then have other people look at it, you have to be a lot more precise in your thinking. So it helped me think through
Totally.
things a lot more. The other thing was, I think some of the ideas that we played with at Nexon, I found to be, frankly, much more powerful than any of us expected when I was at Nexon. So we went in with some things like, for example, in 2017, we got really serious about AI in games. And that was really powerful. And then the challenges of being very innovative in a large company. So all those things we experimented around with, and we found those ideas were really powerful and surprised us in terms of what came back. So I think that those need to be explored a lot more deeply. And one of the best ways to do that is bounce those ideas off of other people. And I always look for smart people to push back on me and find the smartest and most thoughtful people that I can get to tell me where I'm wrong. And if I can sort of survive their withering criticism of any idea I have, usually it turns out to be a pretty good idea. Not always, but a lot of times. And so part of it is, throw a radar ping out, see what comes back and hear what people have to say. And I think everybody right now, when I left Nexon, or announced that I was going to leave Nexon, I did a couple of interviews where I said, listen, we've had a great run, but I think the industry is heading for some real big challenges. And a few people came back to me who I know well, said, and you sound kind of depressed. And I'm like, I'm not depressed at all. I had a great run and I'm totally happy, and I'm happy with where the company is and those sorts of things. Here we are a year and a half later or so, and it's kind of rough. And I think everybody, has seen the tens of thousands of layoffs we've had in the industry and the challenges that everybody's facing, and we're in a very, very different place. So, I sort of want to explore those ideas because I think the stakes are very high. And if we can get out of our own heads and think through this stuff, we've got enormous opportunity in front of us.
Totally. And I relate to much of the idea of thinking and learning in public. That's very much been a foundation of our entire business here at Navic, and a great way to spur conversation. So yeah, I mean, props to you for taking that approach. I think more conversation in the industry is better, especially when there are challenges. So everyone can be thinking together and putting their heads together on how to tackle the future.
For
But
sure.
let's go ahead and start talking about some of the ideas in your essays. And there are, I think, really like four primary essays to kind of dig into in this conversation. And let's start with the one that you titled on not misreading the minimap. In this essay, you lay out a helpful minimap framework that segments the industry in, I guess, a tactically helpful way for thinking about how to manage a game's business. And maybe you can tell our industry what this framework is briefly in case anyone hasn't read it, but also would love for you to unpack how you used it in real life to refocus Nexon in a major way when you were CEO.
Sure. So this idea of like how to split up and think about the industry is really, it's embarrassingly simple. It's just one way. There are many ways to think about our industry. This is just one of them. And it came out of what we were doing at Nexon and grappling with what to do and what not to do. But to summarize it very quickly, if you think about the industry, people think about mobile games, they think about casual games, they think about Xbox, console, PC, and all those sorts of things. And they sort of they get confused sometimes about what game we're making. And we needed to simplify it down a lot. I didn't, in a lot of ways, when we came up with this, we were of the mind that the platforms are converging anyway. So, platform mattered a lot less. What really mattered was, is it a casual game or is it a hardcore game? And, there's a lot of different words for those two things, but like hardcore, we call deeply immersive, meaning you're going to play a long time at one session. You're going to play for a long time, maybe years on end. So that's one axis. That's what we made the vertical axis. And then on the x-axis, we made offline and online. And so, there's a lot of hybrids in this stuff. Sometimes you can have people talk about mid-core. Some games start as offline games and then they become more online experiences like GTA 5 or COD or what have you. But that's a pretty simple way to do it. Some things are pure hardcore online. And up in the upper right-hand corner of the quadrant of the graphic that we made was EVE Online. That's a hardcore. You are going to play that for a long time. This is a game I really love, but you're going to play it for a long time and it's very complex to play and you can only play it online. Another would be the Battlefield 1942, which is the original one in the series, or the finals from Embark Studios. Those are purely online, relatively hardcore experiences. So that's the basic of what it is. How it came up was, it was 2019. For a variety of reasons, we felt that we needed to reorganize the company. We didn't end up doing any layoffs really. But what we needed to do is have some very hard discussions about what we were going to do and what we're not going to do, because some stuff was definitely not working. And we had, as in any organization, you're going to have huge debates about why we need to be in a certain business, why we don't need to be in a certain business. And for us, one of the big questions was casual games. And should we be in the casual games business? Remember, this is 2019, so it was still very considered as pre-IDFA. It was a time when, there was a lot of reasons to be in the casual games business. And we looked at it and we said, look, we're not very good at this. What we need to be good at to be successful in this business.
Sure.
And so let's think about what our roots are, where we really like to spend our time, who our staff is, and what we're doing. So this is not like we didn't hire McKinsey to help us think through the industry. They never would have come up with anything like this. We just wrote it I wrote it up on a whiteboard and I said, okay, guys, what are we doing here? And let's think through each one of these. And it made the decision making very easy. So that's the genesis in a nutshell.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that's cool. I like how simple ideas like that can have a lot of power in wrangling complexity and trying to, take like just multifaceted situations where there's a ton of games, a ton of projects, a lot going on, and you can kind of slice it in a simple way to drive a very straightforward strategy. I guess just to dig like one layer deeper there, like what was it actually operationally like to implement that kind of change in your business? Was it harder or easier than you expected? Were there certain like really big things after you came up with the big picture strategy that you really had to nail and the team had to work on? Like maybe you could just paint the picture a bit more for us.
Yeah, I mean, the by sort of laying it out, how sometimes when you just say something that is sort of a vague idea in your mind, if you put a name on something or if you write it down on a piece of paper, it becomes tangible. Just writing it on the whiteboard and then starting to talk through it made a lot of things very tangible. And I sort of made the point in this in the essay, but like, here are the things that change by quadrant that nobody really examines. Like I've been in a million of these conversations over, decades, and nobody really examines it. So for example, what's the customer experience? The customer experience in a casual game, like let's say a hyper casual game that's offline, is utterly different from like, again, EVE Online or the finals, right? Like like they're not even in the same universe. Well, guess what? The developer skills are also utterly different. You cannot take a person from, I mean, it's happened, but it's very rare that someone transfers between one of these quadrants to another quadrant. How you manage the game is totally different. The tracking is totally different. Like how you define success. So, for example, in mobile games, you live off of the discussion of eCPI versus LTV, effective cost per install versus the lifetime value of the game. And you can take that metric into a hardcore online game, but but if you obsess over that in the near term too much, you're gonna miss the larger picture that will keep people retaining in the game for a very long period of time. So the way you hire, the way you manage the business, the way you count up the money, and your effectiveness, all your KPIs, every way you operate this business is totally different. And when you think through it, you spend a couple hours, like literally just a couple hours to think through it. What you realize is these businesses are so different as to be almost different industries. And when I think about the, Gladiator Academy that is the iStore, the Apple Store of trying to get people's attention to download a game and then, monetize them as quickly as possible, that's an utterly different business. And so if you're a manager like me trying to figure out how to structure a company, it has enormous implications. If you're an investor, and I talk to a lot of investors, you just can't take the old world, the old way of looking at something and apply it to a new way. And we dealt with this very specifically in Japan because Nexon is listed in Japan, and I talk to a lot of Japanese investors and equity analysts, and they'd be like, okay, well, how many units are you going to sell? Like literally they would ask me how many units we would sell because there's such a rich tradition of selling boxes in the channel. Now, that doesn't happen much anymore, but their models in Excel look pretty, are still sort of, that legacy is still very strong. And I was like, look, we could end up doubling our business in a few years without ever introducing a new product. So your obsession about catalysts and your obsession about what our pipeline is, I get it, but it's only a small part of the picture. Here's a list of questions you ought to be asking me if you want to figure out whether, and so we spent thousands and thousands of hours with people dealing with this exact thing. So it has enormous implications. And I think maybe the most relevant thing is if you work in the video games industry, you have to think through these things hard. I knew a lot of people who were very, very successful, console, meaning hardcore game developers. And they were brilliant at that. And they really knew how to do it. And then they went to casual game companies. There were a lot of those people at EA at the time that that I left EA, and they ended up at these, casual games companies. And it was really, really a hard transition for them because all their old ways of thinking about the business were no longer applied.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's super interesting. So I guess when you look across the industry today, who out there would benefit the most from going through the same type of exercise you guys did? Like, I guess this is primarily a focus question. Like, who has the most to gain from dialing in their focus in order to best be prepared for success in the future?
That's a really good question. Do you mean by companies or people or categories of people or?
Yeah, I mean, however you want to take that. If you want to bundle companies of a certain type together, that's fine. If you want to get specific, that's fine too. Just curious where your head goes when you think about like how this exercise like really should be used by others.
Well, I guess my thought is everybody should be asking these sorts of questions and trying to piece apart or deconstruct in their own heads how certain aspects of things work and go down to sort of first principles. And so if you're an employee, if you're a game developer, let's say, and you just really love online role-playing games, or even not even role-playing games, but just online games where you're going to be playing for a long time. I happen to love that category a lot. I love all the genres, but I happen to love that a lot. You have to think long and hard about how you're going to spend your day. And if the world of casual games or offline casual games or hyper casual games is not inherently interesting to you, you're probably not going to be very good at it. And there's going to be people who are better at that. I think for companies have to think long and hard about strategy because the single biggest mistake that you see companies do is they try to do everything and they don't really know what they are as a company. And so you have to make the hardest choice is that you have to decide what not to do. And for us at Nexon at that time, it's a very different time now. This was, several years ago, half a decade or more that we made this decision. But for us, we had to make the hard decision in the face of a lot of withering protest. about what we were not going to do. And so I think any company is in that boat, and most companies get it wrong in some way. Maybe you've got a developer who you really like and you're swayed by their arguments, or you've got a board member, or you've got a trend that you think you need to follow. And so I think everybody can benefit from that a lot. I mean, there's some companies right now who are just sort of all over the place, and they are
Yeah.
flailing about.
Yeah,
Um,
that's kind of where I'm coming from mentally. We don't have to take shots at anyone specifically, but like even when you think about like the big platform companies, like a business like PlayStation, was thinking a lot about mobile for a while. They were, which they dialed back on. They've dialed back on their like outsized bet on live services and have started dialing back in on the core thing that they're best at. And maybe that's more of like a success case of kind of taking a similar type of exercise. Whereas if you look at Xbox, like there probably is not that focused, and I think they have some other issues. But even when you look across other major publishers, like a Take Two in the same business, they have Grand Theft Auto. They also have Zynga, and I guess maybe that's not bad per se, but it presents challenges in how you think about your focus and direction as a business. I imagine. So yeah, I mean, just kind of when I see how you lay this out and how you implemented it at Nexon, it actually does feel kind of unique compared
yeah,
to what I see elsewhere in these big public companies where like the idea of growth often just means doing more, not doing less. And
yeah,
the idea of doing less in order to be bigger and better is just like a very unique idea that
yeah.
maybe more people need to grasp. I don't know.
Well, when I was at Nexon, like everybody, we really admired Nintendo a lot, and I particularly Iwata-san and Miyamoto-san. Iwata-san was the CEO who passed away sadly a decade ago, but when I just joined Nexon, he was the CEO, and before that, I met him when I was at EA, and they were always a really interesting case study for us to examine, not necessarily always to emulate, but to really understand and what their thinking was about. And if you look at the history of the 15 years of Nintendo, when Iwata-san took over, the place was a mess for many of the reasons that you just mentioned. And they'd come off a very bad console and so on. But he was a product manager he had done that. He did, among other things, Punch Out, and he was really product oriented, and he really made some was willing to make some very hard decisions about what they were and were not as a company. And he was very clear eyed about the legacy that the company was coming from, that they were, everybody talks about being customer first and fun first and all that, those sorts of, cliches, but they truly were. They just didn't care about much else besides that. Or they realized, actually, I would say, phrase that differently. They realized that in order to get to financial success, there was an order of operations. They had to pass through customers loving their products first before they could get to financial success.
Right.
And as obvious as that sounds, a lot of companies have a hard time understanding that. So in order to do that well, they were very clear about what business they were in and what the business they were not. They were not, for example, in the business of outspending Microsoft and Sony on the GPU. They were not going to differentiate themselves in an arms race about, polygons on the screen. And so by staying, one or two steps behind the state of the art in the GPU, they could focus their resources on fun and user interfaces and those sorts of things a lot more than the others. And we always, at Nexon, we were not in the hardware business, but we always really appreciated their mode of thinking, which was go down to first principles, just and just kind of forget about the noise in the industry, and then just decide based off of what and examine that really hard. And that's, there ought to be a book, maybe you'll write the book on the turnaround of Nintendo under Iwata-san, but it's one of the great business histories of all time. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story built by wonderful people, basically. So take that back to what we're talking about. We think that you have to kind of have a map in your mind of what you're going to do, because then what happens is these things turn into daily decisions. and they happen in the heat of the moment in a 45-minute meeting with a lot of personalities around the table. And you just kind of have to have you have to boil it. To simplify your business, you have to give it a lot of thought, and then you simplify it down, and then you can go execute across an organization that, is in different offices around the world, speaks different languages, comes from different cultures, those sorts of things.
I love it. Let's go ahead and switch gears and talk about another essay you wrote called "Sympathy for the Devil," which is a great title, by the way. And in this essay, you're really talking about just the dynamics of AAA games today being these massive multi-$100 million budgets that present all sorts of risk when you greenlight them and have ripple effects for the entire business and for the careers of everyone who's working on these games when you get it right or wrong. And so, I mean, maybe a good place to start here is I'm just curious, what is it like to be the person in the room who is making multi-$100 million budget greenlight decisions? Like, what concerns go through your mind when bearing the weight of that responsibility? And how did that weight maybe make you realize something was broken in that process?
Let's see. First, I'd say that as CEO of a company, you're under enormous pressure to deliver, and you're making these decisions. But I think it's probably least bad for the CEO in the room by comparison to everybody else. I mean, when I was not the CEO and I would just sit in on these meetings when I was at EA 20 years ago, I think I put this in the essay, but we used to joke. It's called Big for Life. We're a group of people who have a really good idea that they're really in love with, go to the CEO and say, "We at the Greenlight meeting, we'd like you to fund the game, and we know your job is on the line, Mr. CEO, or Miss CEO, but it's not gonna, but you really need to do this." And so it'd be like you're sitting there begging for life, like begging for the thing to continue. It's not pleasant for anybody in the room. Maybe it wasn't that unpleasant for me. I was just watching it all go down, but I learned a lot of it, and I remembered this stuff. And then when I was sitting in that seat, I remember those dynamics came back to me a lot. What it boils down to is, a AAA game under the current regime or the current way we do things, which is a holdover from how we did things all the way back when I was at EA, which was a holdover from the way things were done long before I was at EA. So it's a very old and antiquated system. That whole system kind of doesn't work. And if you're the CEO and the management team trying to make a decision on a green light, you're encumbered by a lot of mental models. You are encumbered, but you're not encumbered with a lot of information about what the game will look like and whether it's any fun and whether it will do well. So, as the game starts and as the game progresses during development, how much it's costing you, but that's about it. And so you have these questions are like, okay, is the game that you're showing me going to be fun? Like, let's talk about that. What's going to be fun about this game? Because that fun is probably the most important thing. Okay, so then you have these questions about it. And remember, you're at a Greenlight meeting, you're at the beginning of the development process. Then it's like, okay, well, maybe it's going to be fun for a few people, but is it going to sell in large numbers, right? Because you're in for this massive undertaking. And then the question is, okay, well, how massive is the undertaking? And do the team really know that question? And so you end up, and again, this is not all meetings look like this. This doesn't always happen over a single meeting. There's a lot of variance on this core thing of the Greenlight meeting. But, you have these, it's like being in a dark room with the lights off and there's spiky things all over the room, meaning a lot of ways you can injure yourself or kill yourself, but the light is not on. The only thing is is how much it's costing you. So what do? We end up doing this pantomime of, oh, this is the lore and this is what the graphics look like. And isn't that cool? And so therefore graphics end up taking the front seat because that is something you can see. And you do understand that. And the lore, okay, it's based on XYZ. So what does everybody do? Think of just like strictly as an investor, what do you do? Well, you try to light up the room as much as you can. And so you say, okay, is this like another game? You turn to your marketing person and say, okay, what's the market for this type of game? And the marketing person might say, well, I don't know, but they're not going to say that. So they're going to say, well, it's kind of like, it's an FPS genre game and we know the industry is this big and maybe they'll take a certain percentage share and blah, 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 blah. You go through all these sort of ways to try to get your hands on it. You're making a number of mistakes just by doing that. Number one is you're making a huge decision based off of almost no information. Number two is you're assuming there's going to be, what the game is at the end of the process when you start out the process. And that is one of the biggest inherent mistakes. There's all sorts of other ways that this is fraught. So all these things are going through your mind. And the point that I was trying to make in the post was, in a world in which a AAA game title was a $10 million investment, this was a reasonable thing to be doing, because in a large company, when I joined EA, it was about $15 billion in market cap, and a new game might cost 10. I mean, a really insanely expensive game to develop would be like $30 million. Okay, so like 1/10 of what it is today. In a world where the games cost that much, that makes sense, because you could have, you can make a number of bets, and if you biffed one of them, it would be okay. But in a world in which games cost $300 million to make, it makes no sense at all. It doesn't make any sense from a development perspective, and it certainly doesn't make any sense from a investment perspective of a public company. And then what you're really thinking about is $300 million. If this doesn't work, I'm going to have to go to my board, who's kind of in my grill right now because of something. And there's always something that your board is in your grill about. And then I'm going to have to tell them that I torched $300 million. And I can tell you, I've been there. It is an unbelievably unpleasant conversation. You think about it for months before and after. And you get like kind of one chance to have that conversation. If you do it a second time, they're talking openly, maybe not openly, certainly behind your back and maybe in front of your back about replacing you. And by the third time, you're out, one way or another. The board will fire you, or you'll get an activist investor and you'll be out. And so you end up, as a result of this process at this scale, it doesn't work. And so my point of the whole thing was, and the reason why I called it sympathy for the devil is, okay, just like that's the situation that you're in as CEO. And there's got to be a better way to do things. It clearly doesn't work at the scale that we're at. It's a structural problem. But then, kind of like don't have too much sympathy, because how many people do you find in the industry who are talking about this exact problem and saying, we got a real problem here, this is not making a lot of sense? No, what we've done is gone headlong in this exact process for years and years now. We hit a brick wall. We as an industry have hit a brick wall. There's blood everywhere. And people are going, oh, the industry needs to rethink. Well, this situation has been going on for, more than a decade. And so you really need to think about it and do it differently. And there's a lot about this that you can change. You can do very different things, but they tend to be way off the reservation in terms of how you solve these problems.
Yeah. So it sounds like the core of the issue that you're describing is just when big budgets meets uncertainty, it just creates a lot of risk. And so I'm curious then, like, if there is a structural problem, like, and the old way is broken, what should the decisions look like instead? Or like, is that a dumb question because, with these big publishers, like they kind of have to operate that way in order to stay competitive? Like, how should we be thinking about where these kinds of decisions should go in order to be less broken?
Well, great question. I mean, stay tuned because there's a lot to talk about on that. But I guess what I'd say is, I mean, if you were really to boil it down, it's as you said, like big budgets or big spend against a lot of uncertainty. But let's invert the discussion and say, okay, what do you really get paid for as a CEO or as a game company exec or as an investor? You get paid for you get paid for ROI, right? Like I invest $100 and back at me comes $1 million, 5 years later. So it's sort of like big return on investment and the more you can compress the time, meaning the shorter the return on time that you have to wait for that return, the better. So that's how you get paid. So let's think about that. Well, where have the great returns come from in our industry? Well, probably the single best return on investment over the most compressed period of time that I can think of at the top of my mind is Minecraft. One dude eating top ramen in a dark apartment in Stockholm in February, coming up with a beautiful piece of art that set the world on fire.
Totally.
And do we spend much time talking about that? People spend time talking about, what that developer is doing with his life now more than they talk about what it took to really get there. And the brilliance and the sort of creativity and the sort of sense of life that developer had to create that beautiful piece of art that we all love. And there are other examples, Nintendo, going back to Nintendo, there's examples like that. You can look at League of Legends, what Brandon and Mark did. Very, very high from a strictly investor perspective. It's very, very high ROI, but also from a gamer perspective, the perspective of someone who loves games, those were really wonderful outcomes. And is our industry, especially at the big money tables, at the big publishers, spending any time thinking about that? No, because I can tell you at least in the case of Notch, there was an enormous amount of iteration that went into that game. Like, I don't think, he certainly didn't have to go present to a group of executives who may or may not even play games about getting funding to get his game going. Another really good example, there's some great examples in the indie space. One of the people that I most admire in the industry is Tynan Sylvester, who made RimWorld. RimWorld just came out with an update, and here we are all these years in, and it's just getting better and better every year. He wrote a wonderful book on this exact topic, or not on this topic alone, but on the process of game development. And he talked about how much iteration he did to create the RimWorld that we know today. And so to go at it, you have to think about how to get that iteration process in and get the truly thoughtful developers, the Tynan Sylvesters or the Notches or, the next generation of Miyamotos, sort of put them in charge, have them iterate, and then be okay somehow in making a decision that where you don't know what the outcome is when you start the game development process. And that's where that's where all the goodness is. And that we were thinking about this back in 2019 when I wrote that, I had that whiteboard discussion about what business we're in. We went through this with the Embark team. Embark had just exited EA. They had been building Battlefield after Battlefield after Battlefield. They pioneered this incredible segment of the FPS business, and then what they get asked to do is just sequel Battlefield. And they were happy to do it for the first couple of generations, but after a while, it was like, okay, there's more to life than bigger, better, badder Battlefield. So let's try something new. And what they really wanted was some time and space to think about the game development process, and then also to think about what we could do that hasn't been done before that would be highly differentiated. And I gave it to them. I can tell you I've never taken so much, the nice word is pushback on a deal. The not so nice word is total withering abuse for doing a deal is when we did the Embark deal. But it was all for this reason, was you got to think about, okay, again, if your objective is ROI and your objective is to grow your company, you have to think about what kind of environment you can give to get developers to be able to do something that's new and different. And what they came up with, their first one they came up with was the Finals. The Finals is very much an FPS, but it has server-side destruction and some other pieces of technology that made it very, very differentiated, or makes it very differentiated from what else is out there in the market. It's a beautiful game that I play all the time. The next game, Arc Raiders, is going to be very different as well. So, those are the types of things that you go about doing.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge to think about, because some of those examples, right? Minecraft, Riot Games with League of Legends, like that's not particularly helpful for like the big studios to think about in some sense, because they already have their established teams. In some sense, they already have some of their established franchises. And so it's a conundrum to think about, like, how do you change the way you think about these decisions when you already have a massive structure in place that serves the decisions and the product the way that they have been. And in our initial conversation together, we talked about anti-fragile and kind of the barbell approach that you
Mhm.
were working on at Nexon, which is, of course, like having part of your business not be utterly massively transformed and rethought. It continues doing its thing around your biggest franchises, the forever games that will be run hopefully decades into the future. But also the other side of the barbell, taking more of these unique bets on the embarks of the world. And that was also like pretty interesting and compelling to me at the time when we were talking about that, because when you look across a lot of these other big publishers, there really doesn't seem to be that kind of mindset. There's a lot of
Yeah.
managing of risk, but that's not necessarily in, at least from what I see, the green lighting project of new and interesting games as much as just like cutting what doesn't work and trying to be run more efficiently so that they can just focus around the biggest things that have been working and continue to lean into those franchises at bigger budgets, hopefully for bigger outcomes. So I mean, I guess to kind of like weave this together, like, is the solution for more of these publishers to take that kind of barbell approach in a way that they haven't before, or is there something else to it?
Well, it's a great question. If I were still running Nexon or running some other big game company, which I'm definitely not, because I'm not sure that this is the best way to do it. But if I was stuck running a big video game company now, I would do what I did at Nexon, which is exactly as you described. Meaning, people often don't ask what your job is as a CEO. Like, what are you really there to do? Do you make all the decisions? Do you hire smart and let those people run the company? There's a lot of different pieces of advice you'll get as what you're doing as a CEO. But in my experience, the CEOs that I really admire were able to, and I think we may have talked about this before, they were able to keep this balance. And the balance is, I got to deliver today's business, because if I don't, the company will die quickly. And then I got to deliver tomorrow's business. And I have to think down the road, let's call it 5 years from now, and say, here's where the industry is going. Here's where my company is going. Here's where my company's strengths and weaknesses are. If I don't get ahead of this now, there's going to be problems. And all the companies that I know that have failed have made one of those two mistakes. I started my career at Apple, and Apple grappled with this mightily. But one of the companies that was Apple's hero was Xerox, not the larger Xerox, but Xerox PARC. And then they famously hired all the people from PARC and kind of stole their technology. And today we have the GUI and we have OOP, and we have the laser printer and Ethernet and all these other things that came out of Xerox PARC. Like literally everything we use today, including a whole lot of core AI technology, came out of PARC from those days. But Xerox was smart enough to understand that they were dominating in the office automation business. I mean, it was literally in the world, it was Xerox and IBM. And if you were typing stuff or calculating stuff or making copies, it was those two companies. And then, but they were smart enough to realize that it wasn't going to be like that 10 years from now or 15 years from now. And there were all these ex-DARPA, basically technology people hanging around the industry, and they hired a guy named Robert Taylor, and Robert Taylor was an incredible, coach. He had an enormous eye for talent. He got the best of the best, and then he basically, make a long story short, put the question of, okay, what's the office of the future going to look like, and to them, and they created all this amazing technology. But that was Xerox saying, okay, 5 years from now, here's what the industry is going to look like. 10 years from now, here's what you're going to do when you work at an office or you do productive work. And they came up with, among other things, the graphic user interface. We're not going to type these commands into these data processing machines. We're going to use these as tools that make us smarter and enable us to communicate better. Okay, so take that back to where we are today as a game company. You're sitting in a CEO job. You've got to decide how you invest your money, and you can continue to deliver on today's business. It's going pretty well. You got these big franchises, you got thousands of people all over the world, and they can make the next version of whatever hit game you've got. But that will only work so well. It'll kind of work until it doesn't work. A lot of people talk about Apple, and the John Sculley years was like that, right? Like he had received the Macintosh, and then he optimized the Macintosh mostly by raising prices. And And you could say that Disney had a degree of that, where like the management team received Disneyland and then they raised the prices in Disneyland. And I'm oversimplifying it. But then what happens when something replaces your current business, which always happens? And when I started my career, I was in Japan, and the Japanese electronics companies of those days, they dominated a lot of these industries by then, right? Like their PCs were awesome, their consumer electronics were off the charts, and then they just got wiped out by Apple and Google and Samsung, like wiped out. The consumer electronics industry is basically dead. You used to buy stereo, and like stick it in your, living room. So that went away. So the question is, what do you do that's down the line? And if you have to, and the core job of a CEO is to keep these things in dynamic balance, like deliver today's business and then go and invest for tomorrow as intelligently as you can. But you don't do that by making a few couple $100 million bets, a few $300 million bets. If you're, let's say, a $23 billion game company, you have to think about where the asymmetric upside opportunity is. And so one way to do that is to call that a barbell. And I think of it as like surfing like on a wave where you're barely standing up, because if you lean over too far one way, like to today's business, you're going to forget about tomorrow's business and someone will come in and wipe you out. If you lean too far to today's business, you'll miss your numbers and you'll get fired, or you'll get an activist or something like that. So you have to keep these things in dynamic balance. Companies who do this well, outside the games industry include Amazon, who's done this brilliantly. Apple in its day did this brilliantly. Like Apple under Jobs did this. Nintendo certainly does this extremely well. And I think that's the core question about how you manage this. Sorry, it's a little longer, but it's a fascinating topic.
No, I think it is fascinating too. And I guess just to connect it to another essay you wrote called How Empires Die, you say, and I quote, "If you want a glimpse of where many Western publishers seem to be headed, Ubisoft is the blueprint," end quote. I mean, it's a pretty stark statement. Is it as bearish of a pronouncement as it sounds? Like, how screwed are Western publishers?
Well, I think the point was I was trying to make more than taking aim at Ubisoft, which it could certainly be perceived as. I think the thing that I think it's really a cautionary tale. Like if you don't grapple with this stuff head on, it's gonna end up badly. And Ubisoft's, everybody looks at their stock price because that's like the most tangible barometer of a company's health, and their stock price is ugly. And my point was, everybody's stock price is going to end up like that at some point if you don't deal with this. And so it's less of a bearish pronouncement than a statement of what the stakes are that you have to deal with if by not dealing with it. And I think that's there, but for the grace of God, go I, is sort of like, if you don't deal with this right away, you're gonna end up in a train wreck, and sooner or later. And I think the front line of this train wreck has been what we all read about and talk about, which is the layoffs that have happened. And I think it's really, really bad. And one of the things that maybe one of the reasons why I brought this up, or named the company specifically, is that I do care a lot about corporate governance. People talk about corporate governance a lot, but they talk about it like there are best practices, and here's how you have to construct your board, and here's what here's how it's properly done. There's like a sense of why it's properly done. There's armies of consultants that'll happily charge you $500 or $1,000 an hour to talk to you about corporate governance and tell you what you should do. And yet, despite all that money and despite all that, talk of corporate governance, you get these companies where like they don't know how to ask an intelligent question to their CEO. And, they're supposed to their core job is to represent the shareholders, the owners of the company, to make sure that they do their job. Where is the corporate governance here? And I think it's an enormously important topic. An example outside the games industry is Intel, right? Like when I was growing up in Menlo Park, Intel was the company at a Valley. They had created the 8088. They had, famously done this tactical retreat off of memory chips, DRAMs, because the Japanese had killed them in DRAMs, and they got in the microprocessor business. And thanks to them and a couple other companies, they basically built the business, and they dominated right in the 90s. They just, their biggest problem was antitrust at that point. And they had wonderful, ordinary managers or CEOs like Andy Grove, who was, famously wrote the book, Only the Paranoid Survive. And what are they today? Well, they're a company that their only board member who knows how to make a chip is last I checked, is the guys running the company. Once they replaced their last guy who ran the company, their business has fallen apart. I mean, I don't know how to make a chip. I would be a terrible board member. They should never hire me to be the board of Intel. But it's filled with people like me who don't know how to make chips, right? So
Yeah.
I think take that back to the games business. Where are these questions being asked among these large companies? I think that's an important topic.
Yeah, and you call out Western publishers more in that piece. I mean, do you think differently about Eastern publishers more or less, or I guess to like what extent do you think the problem is geographical or cultural versus just the fact that these like old school companies now, all of them like need to evolve?
Yeah, when I wrote that, I was thinking a little bit more about Western companies because they had come out more of the tradition of packaged goods and to some extent are still evolving from that tradition. It was a lot more acute when I was at EA, right? Like EA had built a very successful packaged goods business, and the internet happened, and then mobile happened. And they were having, in both cases, a real bear of a time trying to figure out how those businesses work, going back to the like misreading the minimap type of thing. And
Yeah.
So, and today, and the Eastern companies, particularly those in Korea and China, are completely unencumbered by what online games are all about. And they struggle with all sorts of things. But knowing, I used to joke that Nexon was, there were people in Nexon who had forgotten more about online games than the entirety of, a Western game publisher had ever learned, but they had forgotten that in the last day more than, the entire of the Western game. They would just be so much more sophisticated about how to think about an online game.
Yeah.
And so I think I was writing more towards Westerners because the situation was a little more acute in terms of how they're thinking about their business. But I think it applies to everybody. I will say one of the things that I am enormously impressed by, especially Chinese companies, and I'll just use Tencent as an example. I've never met a group of people who ask more questions quicker than the Tencent organization. I mean, up and down the organization, from the CEO on down. And like, I'll get in a meeting with them and they'll say, "Hey, how's it going, Owen?" And like, they get you talking, and then they learn and learn and learn. They just, sit there and nod and say, "Oh, well, what do you think about that?" And they will learn. And so they're like a learning machine. And that is by contrast to if I go to Hollywood, for example, and I not only don't usually get a word in edgewise, like I'm listening to all sorts of things about the person who's talking to me, especially if they run a big organization or they've had a lot of experience. And so I learn a lot in those conversations. It's very helpful to me. And but I think over time, it's the Western companies could learn a little bit from how a company like Tencent just like learns and learns and learns. That may be cultural. That may just be people who feel like they have a lot to learn and are able to take that. So I think part of what I was saying was like, we got a lot to learn, guys. And since I grew up in the United States, I was talking more to a Western audience.
Yeah. Also, I feel like maybe, I mean, I haven't been in the industry nearly as long as you, or probably even many people who are listening to this episode. But I mean, there is like a cultural element too, in terms of just like the intensity of the work. And it seems like, especially in the West, many teams have just gotten softer, right? You see more union presence, especially around COVID and kind of the low interest rate era. There was talk in many places about, trialing 4-day work weeks. Whereas, in places like China, like obviously it's great that a company like Tencent is learning like it does, but we also hear about the 996 mentality of just, teams grinding and such. Is that an element at play here too, you think, just from having talked to many companies and observed different cultures across the games industry?
Well, without wading into the number of work hours discussion, and maybe even wading into the return to work discussion, here's what I would say. 20 years ago when I was at EA, I was there for about 9 years. And the big topic from about 2003 to 2000, all the way from 2003 on was, oh my God, China's opening up. Our costs are rising. This is like when it cost $50 million to make a AAA game, or 30 or whatever. Like, oh my God, our costs are rising. We're going to outsource to China, to low cost developers in China. And this was for grunt work of a AAA game, like painting stuff, right? Like painting stuff in Photoshop. So a lot of companies did that. Ubisoft was one. EA did some. I think everybody in the West did this, and there was such a differential between pay scales and work that, and the world is flat. And Tom's Friedman and everybody was talking about the internationalization of the labor force and so on.
Yep.
Okay, so that was a long time ago. Do you think that those literally millions of people have been sitting around and still, happy to paint in Photoshop all day long? No, we're now in their 40s and they are damn good game developers and like really good. They play a ton of games. They've reverse engineered a lot of the tech that they used to have to work on. And they end up building companies like MiHoYo, or, they spin out of Tencent and they do something else amazing. And there are a lot of those people. I mean, it's not like they're not in the tens of thousands. They're in the millions, and they're coming for the world of, the global market. So Wukong is like, oh my God, it's this overnight hit. No, it's 20 plus years in the making. And there's a lot more where that came from. So again, the way I would go at your question is not, hey, you're not doing enough, or there's not enough. We gotta, those things, like I like a work-life balance as much as anybody. I tend to work a lot, but and I would never ask anybody to work harder than I'm working. But I think the thing that we all have to grapple with is that there are some amazing development talent, and they are global, and they have aspirations to have a global audience like we all do. And if we're going to hide behind this idea that, oh, we're more creative than they are, I would certainly call that into question. And because some of the content or games that I see coming out of those regions are enormously good. And, that sort of way that we sleep well at night, that, oh, we're more creative and, they're just like grunts who work all night long. I think that's, in my experience in various countries, that just is a myth. So I think the stakes are high. There's going to be a lot more good stuff.
Yeah, that's true well beyond the games industry too. If you look at manufacturing, robotics, drones, it's a pretty massive list. Electric cars, it's a massive list across so many important things. But it's a great point. Anyways, we could talk about kind of the way things are for a long time, but naturally, the things are not going to stay the same. And if anything, the change might accelerate with the next technology shift, which of course is AI. And so, in another essay called Size Matters, you wrote about how, big picture, how each technology shift the games industry has seen has led to essentially a tripling or quadrupling increase in the size of the games industry.
Tripling, yeah.
The industry tripled after GPUs were invented and brought mainstream, after the internet, took things to a new height, again after mobile. And now, as you write, you seem to think that the AI wave might lead to another tripling. So big picture, maybe you can just kind of talk about how you see that potentially coming to fruition.
There were a couple things. Number one is I started playing video games when I was a kid, and that was the CPU era. And, I was playing on an Apple II. Kids played on Nintendo a little bit after that. That left us with an $8 billion game industry. And that was super big and super cool. And then the GPU, and really it was the GPU plus the CD-ROM came online. And that enabled a whole new class of games. One of the games that I played in those days was called Myst. I think most people have forgotten it now, but it's a fabulous, it didn't look like any game that I had ever played before, but it was wonderful. And it was only enabled because you could do CD-ROMs. And then, we were all starting to play FPSs a lot in those days. And then the internet came along and of course changed everything and redefined a game, and mobile came along and then once again redefined. But in each of those waves, a couple things happened. Number one, the industry tripled. So, the GPU took us from $8 to $20 billion. The internet took us from $20 to $75 billion, and mobile took us from 75 to about 200 billion today. So that was interesting. Number two is the industry always responds really well to technology. And this is a point that Matthew Ball has pointed out numerous times, that unlike music or other forms of entertainment, music, movies, and so on, which surprisingly don't respond well to new technology hitting them. They either go down or they go flat from where they were before. So like the CD-ROM actually didn't help the music industry that much. It sort of helped you buy new media, but to replace your old media. But other than that, and then of course, streaming has been a disaster for the music business. It's been 20 years of darkness, literally, from the time of your first iStore or Apple downloads to today. In those days it was Napster, and now it's just coming back to be bigger than that. The games industry always responds well to dislocations of major new technologies. And what I mean by that is not BS technologies like VR, let's call it, or metaverse or NFTs, which really don't have a big effect on games, believe it or not, but like to serious new technologies like a CD-ROM or the internet and so on. So I was thinking about, okay, well, what does AI really mean? Well, really, a lot of people look at it as a cost savings or a labor savings technology. I don't see it that way at all. I see it's a whole new media, the way that online games are a whole new media. So the second thing you notice is, or the third thing you notice is, it's usually a new crew of people who are able to think through. They're not encumbered by their old mental models. They just invent new stuff. So I'll use the Nexon example. Nexon didn't make any sense to the people at EA when I was trying to buy Nexon, when I ran corp dev at EA. Like, they would look at it and they go, oh, that's a simplistic pixelated game that's in 2D. Yeah, it's online, but that online stuff doesn't matter. And by the way, when I figure out, when I get around to it, I'm going to come up with a really high fidelity version of it and of that game, and I'm going to crush them, right? Because high fidelity is what matters. And we laugh at those discussions today, like, oh, those people were so dumb. They weren't dumb at all. They were just encumbered by their mental models. And so taking that forward to today, you go, okay, well, if patterns hold, and they usually hold pretty well, there's going to be a new crop of people who understand what games are about and why they love games, and then use this new medium not as a automation tool, but as a way to redefine what media we're actually talking about. They'll take AI, and there's some great examples of that. And Mitch Lasky pointed this out in his podcast a few months ago about a company called Anudicon, which makes this game, which I won't describe, but they're clearly thinking about a different way of conceiving what a game is. It's not an FPS in a 3D environment with a bunch of polygons. It's something completely different. So that's one way to look at it, is go, okay, tops down, what do the waves usually do to our industry? Well, that's one way to do it, but it's got some holes in doing it. And then you can say, okay, bottoms up, what would really need to get there? You'd have to have more gamers, you'd have more gameplay per day, you'd have the number of hours have to go up, and then you'd have, so like, what's the revenue per hour per gamer? And so you can make a very simple little table, and you go, okay, well, what would it take for this generation or a new generation of technology to get us to something that did what the previous generations of technology are? Turns out, when you do the math, and I sort of walk through the math in this post, it's actually small changes in a few of those things, like number of hours played per day, amount you spend, going up from an average of 25 cents a day to 33 cents a day. Small changes percentage-wise end up being in massive aggregate changes over time. So then you start to ask yourself, okay, does it make sense that that's happening? And then in order to do that, you have to ask, okay, what's really happening to platforms? And then the platforms are, well, I think the platforms were in a major shift. Everybody's talking about it. We're literally going from walled garden consoles with big GPUs, and that being the world that trying to deliver a game through that orifice of, those large companies to a much more open, bespoke environment where your mobile device is essentially got a killer GPU in it now. It didn't used to, but now it does. It's got a killer networking layer. So I can render a really, really good online game. And those are in billions of pockets, and they're all being upgraded as we speak. So, it means that the total addressable market goes up in terms of GPU enabled devices, goes up by a factor of 10 or so. So all those are tailwinds for our industry. And the major thing that I think is really important here for everybody to remember is, almost always when you think back to these major dislocations that I talked about before, everybody was really unhappy with the state of the art or the state of the industry at the time that those new dislocations came in. I mean, the games industry was sort of not growing that much. People were sort of depressed and so on. And then came the GPU and the CD-ROM. And the same thing happened around the time of the industry. It was like, oh, it's consolidating. We're a few companies. The buzzword of the day is consolidation. Then the internet happens and it just changes everything for everybody. Same thing happened with mobile. And I feel like we're at that stage right now. But we got to get a few things right. So again, the stakes are very high. So that was basically the idea of where we are.
Yeah, that's well laid out. You might find this interesting. This was the essay kind of in my private circles that got the most pushback or questioning.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously you're laying out like something major, the industry going from 200 billion to 600 billion. And lots of people are thinking like, how? And they're looking at your numbers and just, wondering things like, is AI really a platform to expand the industry like mobile? Or like, how exactly does that come to be? Or will average monetization really rise from this technology? Like, how does that make sense? Or like, if there are more gamers coming on boarded, maybe many of these people are coming from poorer regions. Like, how could that make sense? Or,
Yeah.
like, obviously lately a lot of time from gaming has, if anything, kind of been taken away from platforms like TikTok. And so is video still competitive? And there are like all of these different questions that are kind of poking at the different assumptions that you're making. And obviously you're not trying to be super precise in any assumption you're making as much as just painting a directional picture. But
Yeah.
I guess, like, is there anything that you would say to kind of the skeptics of like some of the assumptions you're making, or I guess people that are just kind of caught up on like more of the specifics here?
Yeah. So a couple of things. Number one is, again, I would say it's interesting you say that. I I didn't get any pushback on my negative sounding post that sort of the headline is like, the world is ending. Everybody's like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Somebody's saying it. Yeah, we agree.
Yep.
And then I say something positive. And what I didn't get back was a lot of details about like the assumptions. It was just almost more about the aggregate. Um, and maybe that was because I made the point very clearly that you could take issue with any assumption here, like any and all assumptions. I've been through a million forecasting exercises over the years, and I know how these operate. Basically, everything that I say will be wrong in some way,
Of course.
because they're long-term forecasts. The question in forecasting is, in aggregate, do they paint a worldview that is in more or less right? In other words, monetization may go up a little faster, number of users may go up a little slower, blah blah blah. Like does that work? So I'd say there's that. I think the other thing is, it is enormously difficult to envision a world that runs counter to everything that you're seeing right in front of you today. Humans tend to be bad at that, and that's why forecasting is one of the reasons why forecasting is inherently difficult. In other words, if the sun is out today and it's been that way for 3 months straight, it's kind of hard to even remember what a rainy day looks like, or vice versa. If it's been raining for a long time, it's hard to see. So the games industry, and as humans, we are always encumbered by these mental models and these near-term things that dictate our worldview. This is why environment is important, and getting out there and thinking, forcing yourself in some way to think differently is important. And Today, we all know somebody who's gotten laid off, or many people. We all are seeing exactly the same games. We're seeing a lot of new games introduced that are failures, and we are all seeing the same genres of games. We're not seeing much new these days. Okay, so in that environment, is it easy to think through how these numbers could go up? And this is why I think it's important to think about what's really happening from a user perspective. And I was able to take some of the things that I saw at Nexon and apply them to my view that would counteract some of what you friends said that they mentioned to you, and what I heard as well. For example, when we found at Nexon that, for example, when I joined Nexon, the monetization per user in China was exceedingly low, like per user revenue, however you measure that, average revenue per paying user is how we did it. And Japan was exceedingly high. So like the differential was massive. And they almost, it was hard to compute. It was like much more than 10x. Okay. So over time, over the 13 years that I was at Nexon, it just grew and grew and grew. And Japan grew a little bit, but like kind of went like that. So you had a developing country that was playing more games, and the monetization went up. And it was much more dramatic than what I'm positing here. I mean, it was hugely dramatic. And then, so that's one thing. Also, once you start playing a more immersive game, your hours tend to go up very dramatically over time. And there's a lot more devices in pockets. So we got a lot of people globally who were coming online to the games industry to playing games as a major form of entertainment. And because it's so competitive with other forms of entertainment on multiple different fronts, it's not hard to think at all, if you have that as your experience, that you can see that those numbers go up modestly. So I saw with my own two eyes dramatic increases, but I didn't see dramatic increases. And what I'm proposing here is actually modest increases. But then I think about what the tailwinds are. And again, I think about what's happened with the GPU that most people don't talk about, is the GPU is on every device. Your iPhone, your late model iPhone, is a killer workstation. It's like a console of a few years, of a short number of years ago. And so that's all in your pocket with you at all times. And are we taking advantage? Now, one of the things I thought of after I wrote this was, it doesn't mean that the Western game companies are necessarily going to take advantage of this, because some of this growth comes from the West, but a lot of the additional growth because of new users, is going to come from worlds outside of established Western game markets. And I think that is an issue, going back to your question about China. But overall, I think when I'm talking about the global $200 billion games industry, these numbers are very defensible to me.
Gotcha. We do need to start wrapping up, but maybe a couple more questions. Another one, just like on this AI point, maybe just to kind of dig one layer deeper and put our visionary hats on. Like, do you have any like specific ideas of like how this technology will enable like new forms of play that do open the audience up to many more people, or that people just naturally want to spend more time in? Like how could that industry just like fundamentally look different, or have like new branches that don't exist today? Like, do you have any like more specific thoughts there to kind of back up some of the assumptions that you're making?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on them. I'm not sure that I'm ready to. I've got, this is the forum to introduce those ideas. I'd say generally. So we started implementing AI, and frankly, a series of new technologies, software-based technologies at Nexon, and as I said, in around 2017. And there were two things that came up. Number one was, boy, it's a lot more profound than we really understood and expected. The more we experiment, the more there is. And it requires a lot of iteration to get there, but boy, it's quite profound. So number one is, it's really big. Number two is, it comes in really unexpected ways. In other words, it comes from like outer space in a weird, in like ways that you never thought before. And because it's really a new type of medium, in the sense that the internet was a new type of medium, like what we used to call hypertext, which is today what we call links. Like, you got to understand how revolutionary this was, and people didn't even know how to think about it. They didn't have the metaphors for what hypertext was. If you grew up on books and TV, it was all linear. So the idea that you're like, oh, that's a really interesting topic, I can click a link and then I can go learn more about it or give a definition of a word. All that stuff we do today, like, there was no way to even understand that, really. And so we went through about 10 years of just understanding the new metaphors that matter to us. We are in exactly the same position today. And I'll give you an example that actually isn't about game development, but illustrates this point, and we can take it back to game development. But I'll give you a really quick example. So we started introducing matchmaking, AI-based matchmaking in live games. And let's take a first-person shooter. Within about 17 seconds of you using your keyboard and mouse in a tutorial of a first-person shooter, we can tell where to level you, right? Like, are you good or bad? And the reason why this is really important, obviously, is, I mean, people talk about skill-based matchmaking now, and whether that's a problem, it's been overused, and it's got all sorts of problems. But fundamentally, if you're really good at this FPS and I stink, you're going to get bored and quit. I'm going to get frustrated and quit. The retention rates, that will translate into bad retention rates for both of us. After spending all this money to acquire both of us, the game company loses, right? Especially if it's a free-to-play game. Okay, so that's just ranking based off of leveling. But that's not where the machines went when we started experimenting a lot. In any given liquidity pool of FPS players, thousands or tens of thousands, there's an optimal group of, let's say, a squad of 5 people versus another squad of 5 people. And that squad of 5 people may be ranked in terms of skill sets very differently, but they have different ways of playing, different play styles. Maybe one guy hangs over the other guy's left shoulder, one is super aggressive. And there's an optimal pool that works against another optimal team, and they're much more likely to have fun. So it goes way beyond ranking in terms of skill sets. And the machines can do this on the fly. This is a perfect machine learning or AI problem to optimize for retention, which really means optimizing for fun. And I could hire 1 million humans to do this, and they wouldn't be able to do this within several hours. The machines came up with their own ways of thinking about how to do this. Wow. And so as a result, we're all having a lot more fun, which means our retention number goes up. Retention numbers go up. The company wins. The customers win, right? Like, the players win. All that's great. But it was so orthogonal to how we were thinking about it when we went in. And we never expected this outcome. So my point is that you get a new tool and you have no idea how this new tool can be used. And now with AI, the tool will sometimes tell you how it can be used. Like, you didn't even need to think out. It's talking to you about how it can be used to achieve your objective. And that is such a different way. Like, I want to say it's mind-blowing, but it's not mind-blowing. What it is just different than any way we've ever thought about using tools in the past. And so you take that back to game development, and suddenly, you can get emergent behavior left and right when you're doing game development. This is some of the stuff we started experimenting heavily with at Embark, and it just worked big. So a lot of it didn't work. A lot of our going in assumptions didn't work at all, but a lot of different ones worked a lot. And the weirder they were, the more they tended to work. Or the ones that survived tend to be very weird and unexpected. Yeah. So that's a long-winded answer to say, I got a lot of ideas on this and how to implement that point. But the fundamental thing that anybody can use is a different mode of thinking than we typically have in the game development business.
I agree. And yeah, I mean, I've loved exploring all of these ideas with you today. I guess one other quick question here. Obviously, most of this conversation has been built upon what you've written publicly. Are there any other, big ideas that you haven't written about yet that would be fun to just kind of throw out there for a minute or two and talk about?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot. One of them that I've been thinking about is that I'll write about soon. I was sort of calling it Derek Zuland or industry executive, meaning how to all the trends that we end up chasing in the games industry. Like, as an example, there was a period of about 3 years where I could not get out of any interview or any investor meeting without somebody asking me what my VR strategy was. And
Yep.
I was like, we have none. It sucks. And, my PR people were like, you can't say that, Owen. I was like, yeah, I can, because it happens to be true. And I mean, I sometimes play VR games, but not very often. And as a business, but like in the time, everybody was chasing that. Right. And then, NFT games, metaverse, esports, all those sorts of things. So the question is, why do we do that? And why we do that as an industry so much? That was one topic for sure. Another is about how we make investing decisions and how we have to make, this would be something that's near and dear to your heart, I'm sure, but like the idea that we live off of the DCF, the discounted cash flow. We go into a project as if it's building a bridge where we know what the cash flow, building a bridge across a river and we're going to collect a toll. But in fact, in the real world, first of all, those models are never accurate. But they're used all the time in M&A. They're used all the time in everything. And so is there a better way to think about that? And then more importantly is and then maybe, another really big one is about how we implement technology in companies and how we can better do it. So it goes back to the points that we were making about AI. And so I've been, I don't know, I've got a series of things coming up. And again, they're helpful for me because it helps me think through these issues in much more detail.
Yeah, all makes sense. I guess, I mean, maybe just to wrap, obviously we've talked about a bunch of things. We've talked a lot about how these ideas, probably should fundamentally change the way that a lot of big companies in our industry, think about managing themselves. And obviously, you are someone who has been in that seat, and doesn't seem to be, you might be out of that seat temporarily, but you're still obviously like really interested in thinking about the future here. Anything you want to say just about how all of these ideas are kind of guiding, your future and kind of what you're thinking about next?
Well, I was hugely, so again, when I was a kid was when the PC came out, and I remember the adults around me talking about how revolutionary it was, but it was just normal for me to want to get, I'm older than you, so I remember the days of the Apple II. You may have read about it once or twice because it's ancient history now, but like it was just natural for me to play with an Apple II or similar computer. The kids had different computers, but
yeah, that was RuneScape for me in its own way. Yeah,
it was RuneScape. Yeah, so exactly. And so RuneScape, for you was like kind of natural, but for a lot of people, it was like, what the hell? Like how is this low poly thing like appealing for kids? And so I think and then of course my career started in earnest. I got out of school at really the dawn of the internet, and I remember everybody who was, I had studied at that time a lot of, and I was sort of, my heroes were some combination of the technology titans of the day. This would have been in the early to mid 90s, and the media titans of the day. So, the Eisners and Ovitzes and, those sorts of people who were running Hollywood. And and they were, in each of those times, the adults, the people who were the titans of their day, were baffled by what was coming, but they were like, we got to be really serious about understanding this internet thing. And we sort of make fun of them in hindsight now of talking about the information superhighway, or, what's a homepage or things like that. They were grappling for metaphors to help them understand. And they were smart enough to realize that this new wave of technology was going to change everything. But they couldn't figure out how to find the signal in the noise. They couldn't figure out how it was going to change their business. And certainly nobody in those days could have ever conceived of a TikTok or an Instagram, like basically replacing their business. And what are those companies now? There's really only one survivor, which is Disney. And from what I understand about Disney, which is pretty limited, it's probably no more sophisticated than yours, but I think they're basically in a panic because they understand that so much can change about their business. And they're the only survivor of the traditional media titans of their day, right? So,
yeah.
they knew the storm was coming and it was going to replace everything. And what it replaced with was something was more compelling as a consumer and actually a lot bigger and more interesting. But it came from essentially new modes of thinking. And so you apply that today and you go, okay, well, I would respectfully submit, based off of my own experience, which is substantial in implementing AI as early and as aggressively as anybody in the games business, I'd say, boy, this is really big. And I look back and I think that it could really change a lot of things and make a much better, more healthy industry based off of what I've seen with my own two eyes, and really with a lot of stakes in the table. I think you could look at it as, oh my God, this is a threat, which is how some people look at it. Or you could say, boy, this is a great opportunity. I want to be part of this. And it's exciting creatively. It's exciting as a business. And so part of what I think we really need to do, and what I really want to do, is be working with creative people who are able to think differently, who are able to get out of their own heads, and to and probably a lot of those people are new generation people, and then build a better industry for all of us, because it's kind of messed up now. And so that's what I'm working on.
Love it. Well, can't wait to see more about what you're working on, and maybe talk about it one day in more detail with you here. But we should probably wrap up here. We're a bit over what we our usual time allotment. But Owen, I mean, it's always a real pleasure chatting with you and really digging deep into how you see the industry in the future. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
And to all of our listeners, thank you as always for tuning in as well. And we'll catch you in the next episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co, or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.